everyone. Welcome to episode 227 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris. And we're going to start off with thank yous.
We have a fun thank you, which is we got surprising book mail from a listener.
Yeah, thank you so much to Kathy, who sent a cookbook that Emily had checked out of the library many times before.
Yeah, there might have been a few pages that stuck together thanks to all my cooking with it. And I talked about this being one of my top 10 books of 2024. And Kathy sent a copy for us to have and said, you should have your own copy. Thank you so much, Kathy. That was really thoughtful. This is The Cookie That Changed My Life and more than 100 other classic cakes, cookies, muffins, and pies that will change yours. Nancy Silverton with Carolyn Carreño. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. We are so grateful to have 3 new patrons over on Patreon. Welcome to Diane, Rachel, and Trish.
Thank you so much for your support. We also got 2 personal donations, which means they just sent us money. You don't always have to join Patreon if you don't want. Thank you to Anna and Adele for your contributions to the podcast.
Thank you all so much. Your support means so much to us. We also want to congratulate Tina, who was the winner of our romance bingo card drawing. Tina had a bingo, and she submitted her card. Thank you to everyone who participated in our Year of Reading Romance in 2024. Whether or not you did the bingo card, we really enjoyed talking romance and having great interactions with everyone. So thank you. And again, congrats to Tina.
It just so happened that she received her bookshop.org gift card right at her birthday. So she was able to do some extra shopping. So happy birthday also, Tina.
Yeah, meant to be. So speaking of the romance bingo card, we are going to have a Ghost Stories bingo card this year, 2025, to celebrate our year of reading ghost stories.
We're going to create a tab on the website, bookcougars.com, very similar to what we did the year we were doing the Scarlet Summer. We are going to put links to the bingo card, also to our Goodreads conversation pages, for the Haunting of Hill House read-along, for ghost stories in general, and also for our year of reading these Penguin ghost stories.
Yeah, we'll put the reading schedule for those up there. So, you know, the bingo card is going to be kind of similar to last year. The top row will be our 4 quarterly read-alongs and also the Penguin Book of Ghost Stories. That's a big one. That's 19 stories to read there. We're also going to have some other categories, some specific books that are classics in the field. Check it out on our bookcougars.com website. Look for the Ghost Stories tab, and we will talk more about the Ghost Stories bingo card on the next episode, because we will have, by then, a couple squares checked off, hopefully.
Oh, that's right. We also want to thank everyone who's been purchasing books through bookshop.org. We really appreciate your support there. We're an affiliate of bookshop.org, so when you buy books, you support local independent bookstores and the Book Cougars.
Absolutely. And not exactly breaking news anymore, but it's been within the last couple of weeks, so perhaps it's still considered breaking news. Bookshop.org now has ebooks. They've created a dedicated e-reader app that you can download onto a tablet, or you can read books via their website if you don't have a tablet or you don't like to read on your phone. But it is an app similar to like Apple's Book app or the Kindle app. Andy Hunter, who is the founder of Bookshop, rolled this out when it was ready to be rolled out. There's a lot of talk for a long time about them offering ebooks, but he is very careful to not do too much too fast and to roll things out when things are ready to be rolled out, because there's nothing worse than having a big announcement, right? And then everything crashing.
Yeah, or just it being buggy, which is so annoying.
It's been a good rollout from what I understand, and I have downloaded the app, and I did download a book. I'll talk more about that later on in this episode, but he is also planning to eventually create an alternative to Goodreads.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
So, and you know, we're being a little cagey, but all of this is because they're trying to compete with Amazon. And I have some issues with Amazon, so I'm thrilled that there's an alternative.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, Amazon owns Goodreads. Goodreads had been independent, and then they got snapped up by Amazon, as so many bookish good things have been. So people are looking for alternatives. I know there's Storygraph, which I'm using this year, and that's really fun and interesting. But, you know, if bookshop.org starts something similar to Goodreads, that means you'll be able to keep track of your reading and purchase books directly. So that's going to be potentially another bookish empire.
Yes,
but hopefully it will stay independent.
Yes, and keep supporting bookstores.
Yeah, independent bookstores all over the country, which is fantastic.
Yes. Chris, what are you currently reading?
Well, I'm currently reading a book I never thought I would read. It's the first book in Marcel Proust's long, 7 or 8 novel long, memoir-ish, fictionalized account of his life. So it's Swan's Way is the first book. And, you know, I'm really enjoying it. The prose is very smooth and wonderful, but it is stream of consciousness. So you're reading along about him being in his bedroom as a child, and all of a sudden he's talking about this other person. And so you have to, like, pay attention. And I sometimes have found myself going back to reread a paragraph because I got lost in his thoughts. But I'm really enjoying it a lot. And I'm also reading O Pioneers by Willa Cather for Colleen's year of reading Willa Cather. And I'm reading the Proust for Robin's Proust pilot project. So what's interesting is that both of these novels were also published in 1913, which I didn't realize until I started looking up magic lanterns, because magic lanterns appear in both of these novels very early on, like page 9 and 12 or something. So a magic lantern was like a sleeve or something you could put in front of a candle or a light to cast images on a wall. And in O Pioneers, a friend of the main protagonist has one, and he's going to bring it over to entertain her father who's on his deathbed. And in Proust, it's something that his mother introduces into his room to kind of, she thinks, entertain him and keep him occupied, but it's kind of freaking him out because he loved his bedroom. He got it settled to the point, he says something along the lines of, it was so settled that he didn't think about it anymore, just like he didn't think about himself, which I love that. But then there's this new thing introduced into his bedroom that he has to now deal with, new thoughts coming into his head and everything. So I had no idea there would be connections between these two books. There are also other connections. So more to come on that, but I'm enjoying both of them very much.
Fun. I just started Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. This is the biography by Ruth Franklin of Shirley Jackson. And I just started the introduction because you have mentioned that there are spoilers. I mean, she makes it very clear by chapter when she's referring to some of Shirley Jackson's work. And since I'm starting The Haunting of Hill House this weekend, I don't want any spoilers, but I thought I could start the biography at the same time, the same weekend. I love that she has the sentence that Shirley Jackson was prone to myth making. She already in the intro talks about Shirley Jackson's love of witchcraft, which I think is really interesting. And also just her place in society at the time, you know, when she was raising children in the 40s and 50s and trying to have a career. So I am so excited. I already love Ruth Franklin's writing. Great writer. I am also listening to it and reading it, and the narrator on the audiobook is Bernadette Dunn. And it's a chunkster. I think the audiobook's like 20 hours or just under. Again, that's called Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, the biography of Shirley Jackson. And I believe this is going to appear on the Ghost Bingo card.
Indeed. Yeah, that is a great biography, actually. And I enjoyed the audiobook.
I'm also reading the novel Good Dirt by Charmaine Wilkerson. This book just came out in the end of January. I loved her novel Black Cake, which was her debut. This is her sophomore novel. Charmaine Wilkerson is a journalist also, and I think that really comes out in this novel. I don't remember feeling that way when I read her debut. It takes place in Connecticut on the Sound, which is where Chris and I live, so it's very familiar. The novel goes back and forth in time with different points of view and far back in time from current day to the time of enslaved people coming from West Africa to the American South. There is a family heirloom involved in this novel, and it explains that enslaved people made pottery, and this is a big jar that's been passed down from generation to generation. And there's an author's note in the back of the novel, and I'm doing everything I can not to read it because I'm afraid it'll spoil things. But I wonder if, since she's a journalist, if that's one of the things she really wanted to explain in this fictionalized account, because I had never heard about that. I didn't know there was a lot of pottery made in the South by enslaved people. There's a tragedy that takes place very early in the novel, which I don't want to talk about because I don't want to spoil it, but I am loving this so much. Again, it's called Good Dirt by Charmaine Wilkerson. What did you just read, Chris?
Well, I finally, drumroll, read Louise Penny's latest novel, The Grey Wolf. This is number 19 in her Chief Inspector Gamache mystery series. And it came out in October, and I bought it on the day it was released, as I do with Louise Penny novels. And then I didn't read it. I just didn't. I guess I must have been into something else. I know I had COVID that got in the way of things, and then life, right? I also realized when you and I were talking last week, Emily, you asked me, like, why do you think I haven't started it? And I said all of those things. I said, but also, like, there was something holding me back from reading it, and I wasn't sure what it was. So I realized when I was first picking it up and looking at the cover, which is beautiful, 2 white wolves, or gray wolves, I suppose, that I was afraid it was going to suck.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, because
wow.
I feel like I've read enough series that eventually they get to some point where the writer they lose interest. Their ideas are just not in line with the rest of the series. But that didn't happen with this book.
Oh, I'm so relieved. I started to sweat.
Yeah, I was really worried about that. And I think part of me didn't want to know if that was going to be the case. And I have no idea why it happened with this book in particular, 19. But, you know, Louise Penny has taken time off in the past when she's like, I couldn't make another one happen this year. I needed time. This one took longer. Like, she also is at the point in her career, and she's big enough to be able to say to her editor, it's not going to happen this year. And they're not going to drop her or anything for that. Long story short, I love the book. It is one of those Louise Penny novels where the main situation is solved, but there's an ongoing story still being told with this. And you can almost say that for like the last, I don't know, I haven't reviewed the whole series, which is one of the ways I was kind of delaying myself by saying like, oh, before I read this next one, I should go back and review all of the books so I understand where we are in the series. So I'm not exactly sure when things started in the line that we're currently seeing with corruption in law enforcement and in government in Canada. Probably 10 books, I would say, at least. So it's carrying on in that vein. But this book, some of it is set in everyone's beloved Three Pines, which is the town that no one can find unless they need it, which is a lovely place just over the border from Vermont, a small village. But a lot of the other scenes are kind of around Canada and in other countries as well. This book involves, of course, law enforcement, politicians, the mafia, engineers, monks, and nuns. So this one is kind of like wide-ranging in a lot of ways.
Does it involve gray wolves, or is that like a moniker for something?
It's a moniker for something.
Okay.
Although there is a wolf in the book.
I don't want to make spoilers. I didn't read it, so I don't want to ask a question.
No,
that
not
leads
at
to a
all.
spoiler.
I mean, the next book in the series, which is already announced at the end of this book, is The Black Wolf. So there is a gray wolf and a black wolf. I love Penny's writing. I love her sensibility. She is a wonderful liberal person in the way of caring about diversity and the environment and legacies. So there's some of that in the book, but then a lot of action. One of the issues, you know, with the mafia being involved in this one is that international trade is becoming more and more connected with international terrorism as well as domestic terrorism. But also it has shifted in part from like weapons to environmental resources. And one thing, I don't know if she mentions it, but also trafficking. And already they're seeing a rise in human trafficking just with some of the Trump policies that are being enacted within the last few weeks. So really, it's a timely book, and it is dark. That is one thing I've noticed with different series I've read, like from Nevada Bar to Patricia Cornwell, although Patricia Cornwell's kind of always been dark. Maybe she's just gotten more paranoid, or her character has. But it's dark. It's real. This is not an escapist novel.
And you feel like the earlier ones were?
Not necessarily, because the first one...
I read the first one.
Even the first one, was it called Still Life, I think? You know, there's a hate crime, a homophobic thing that happens in there. So I know some people initially called that a cozy. I don't think it was a cozy. I don't think she's ever had that. I think what makes some people feel that way is the coziness of Three Pines, the village. But Louise Penny has never, shied away from the evils in people's hearts and the evils that people do. It's just gotten bigger in scope, let's say. She's co-written a book with Hillary Clinton, so I can imagine some of the conversations they've had about what's going on domestically and internationally. Domestically for Hillary is the U.S., obviously, and for Louise Penny is Canada.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty convenient to have Hillary Clinton on speed dial if you have questions when you're writing political intrigue.
Right, exactly. One of the lines I'd like to read, it's actually 2 sentences, 2 or 3, maybe 4. Gamache was very aware of the warning not to attribute to malice that which can be explained by stupidity. There was much more stupidity around than malice, though both were dangerous, and he never discounted the malicious.
Wise man.
Yeah, so that was The Gray Wolf, number 19, in Louise Penny's Chief Inspector Gamache novel. I cannot wait for The Black Wolf to come out. Not going to make any promises. I'm thinking I'll be getting it on release day and enjoying it. We'll see.
But maybe you will. And thank you to listener Lorraine, who poked Chris in the side and said, come on, girl, let's go. We want to hear what you have to say.
I appreciated that poke so much because, you know what? I mean, even though it deals with hard things that are very similar to today, what we're experiencing, it is a bit escapist because you're in a story.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
But one that feels like it's happening now.
I finished the new novel by Amy Bloom, I'll Be Right Here. This comes out on June 24th. Thank you to Random House for an early copy. You know, I've talked to you about my complaint about novels not having tables of contents. This had a table of contents. Thank you, Amy Bloom. It's like she did it for me. I really like it. I like to be able to refer back, especially if there are different characters, and not have to figure out what chapter it was. So I really appreciated that. This is definitely a novel with no plot. So if you're someone who likes plot, you will not like this novel. It's definitely literary, beautiful writing, and it's about chosen family and how family is created from the ashes of war. The character Ghazala comes to New York City after World War II, and she's working in a bakery when she meets the Cohen sisters, which are great characters, and their parents, and they become fast friends, lifelong friends, and really adopt Ghazala into their family. And eventually, Samir arrives, and he's been beaten by war in a very different way than Ghazala was, and they make a home together. The novel covers years where the friends marry and grow their families, and they live life. And that's really what the story is about. I've read some reviews of it, and some people don't really understand what the story's about. And I think that's kind of the point. It's just a character study about people's lives and the effects of war and how it forever changes your future. As the characters age, the younger people refer to these original characters as the greats, which I loved that reference. Ultimately, I felt like this story was about love, which is a really good message in these days. And it was comforting to read. Again, that's I'll Be Right Here by Amy Bloom, coming out on June 24th. She's just a beautiful writer. We should mention that she was a guest in an author spotlight on episode 153, talking about her last book, which was called In Love, which is a memoir about the final days of her husband's life when he's diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. and asks her to figure out how he can end his life. Really beautiful memoir. An amazing audiobook, which she narrates as well.
Well, I finished a book I've been reading for a while. This is a buddy read with Sigrid, A New Home, Who'll Follow. This is by Caroline Kirkland, and it came out in 1839, so it is an older book, and it's fiction. I've been referring to it as a memoir about her time in the frontier of Michigan in the 1830s. But then I was looking at the publication data page, and it's listed as Michigan History to 1837 fiction. I was like, fiction? So, yeah, fiction. So it's kind of based on letters she had written home to people back east about her experiences, and then she put things together and fictionalized it. But it's still very much based on her experience, kind of like Swan's Way is based on Proust's experience, but that's also considered fictional. I enjoyed this book so much. It started off with a bang for me. It kind of got bogged down a little bit in the middle, but then the last half dozen chapters or so, maybe a little bit more, really picked up again, and I finished it in a flurry. And we had a really wonderful conversation about it. One of the things that was surprising to me was that they're drinking green tea. And we weren't sure what was meant by green tea, because my first thing was like, green tea, like today, like everybody's wild for green tea and they think it has all these health benefits. And I thought, that seems really interesting that they're drinking green tea back then, because I'd only ever heard people say they're drinking tea in older books. They didn't really usually distinguish what kind of tea. So then we were wondering, though, does she mean green tea like we understand it, or is it new tea? Like green as in new.
I wonder if it's mint tea.
Right, yeah. So I want to look into that a little bit more. And then one of the things that really struck me, this is written by someone in the early 1800s. Back up for people who didn't listen to a prior episode. The Michigan front is the frontier of the United States for white settlers anyway at this time. And she and her husband are heading out to establish a town in Michigan. They've bought plots. They start off with a little log home while their frame house is being built, and they're plotting things out. They're trying to get people to come and buy plots to, obviously have a tax base and things like that to create this town. And they're all different sorts of neighbors who come along from all different places. She makes some interesting points about some people who just can't make it, which also is in O Pioneers by Willa Cather, which I'm currently reading. There is that connection about people who come out and they just can't make it there either, and they're escaping wherever they're from because they couldn't make it there. One of the other points that Sigrid brought up was that Caroline Kirkland doesn't go quoting the Bible a lot. Like she has, is it epigraphs before each chapter, like sometimes multiple ones from various people and works of literature, but she never quotes the Bible. And for that time period, that's kind of unusual that she's not doing that. And so, I'm pretty sure I studied parts of this book back in grad school, and I think Caroline was really showing her education and how well read she was by having all these quotes and literary allusions and things like that. But then to not include the Bible was very different for a writer of that time. So really interesting book, a lot to think about. And you can't help make comparisons to today. I'm so glad to have read this, A New Home Who'll Follow by Caroline Kirkland. And this is somebody who Edgar Allan Poe said is a major American writer. They were buds.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I finished Finlay Donovan Digs Her Own Grave by Elle Cosimano. This is the 5th book in the Finlay Donovan series. I have read all of them. I love them. This book is out on March 4th. Thank you to Minotaur Books for the early copy. Minotaur is the same publishing house that publishes Louise Penny. I just love the characters in this novel, or in this series, I should say. Finlay is back with her nanny, Vero, who is her partner in crime. And this time they aren't burying bodies, which they've done in the earlier books, but instead the nosy neighbor, Mrs. Haggerty, across the street, who's always peeking out her window to see Finlay's antics, is taken to jail because a body is dug up from her backyard.
Oopsie.
Oops. And Mrs. Haggerty becomes a character in this novel. We learn much more about her backstory. She ends up moving in with Finlay, which is hilarious. It's a different novel in the sense that there's more about some of the characters that have been in the prior novels, which I suspect is what starts to happen with Louise Penny books as well. So I don't know if you could jump in on book 19 of Louise Penny's series. I wouldn't recommend jumping in even on book 5 with Finlay Donovan. I know they always want to say these are standalone novels. You would probably really enjoy her writing, but I think if you really want to understand the characters and what's happening in this novel, you should start at the beginning. I'll just say that. What really comes up in this book, and I would say this is a content warning, is domestic violence. And when I was reading it, it made me think about Roxane Gay. I don't remember if she said this at one of the events that we went to or if it's in an interview that I've just heard her talk about. Why do we live in a culture where we have the term rape culture? I thought about that as I was like, why do we have domestic violence? I know that's like a rose-colored glasses perspective, but it really comes up in this novel, and Mrs. Haggerty, her neighbor across the street, plays a pivotal role in that. It's also funny, which is one of the things I like about Elle Cosimano. She can take serious subject matter and you're still laughing and enjoying the characters. And Finlay still has her 2 toddler kids, and she's a novelist as well. And her editor gets involved in this story in a very funny way and is always pushing her to be doing more when she's busy with bodies that are being buried and dug up. It's blurbed on the front by Janet Ivanovich. Finlay Donovan is irresistible, and I think that's a good word for these novels. So again, this is called Finlay Donovan Digs Her Own Grave, coming out on March 4th, which gives you plenty of time to read some backlist.
So 2 things about everything you just said. Louise Penny reading novel 19, coming in fresh to that. It'd be really interesting to talk to somebody who did that, who hasn't read anything of hers and jumped in on book 19. I mean, I think it would still be a gripping story, but you certainly just wouldn't have those layers of context of who Gamache is and these other characters and what they've all been through together. Because there are some characters from past books that come in and everything.
I think if you're a reader who enjoys character development, that's the thing about jumping into a series late, that you just wouldn't appreciate it. Because they always throw out those couple sentences to give you context for who that person is. Mm-hmm. But you know that there's a lot more backstory.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other thing you mentioned was blurbs. I don't know if you heard the news that Simon & Schuster are no longer going to require their authors to get blurbs.
Yes.
Which, we've talked a little bit about blurbs in the past. Are they worth it? Are they not? I mean, I think they can expose readers to a new author. Like Sarah Waters one time blurbed a book, and I was like, whoa, because I'd never seen her blurb a book before, so I read the book. Whereas like Stephen King, who is a blurb whore, his blurbs don't mean anything to me anymore.
Yeah,
no offense. No offense, Mr. King.
Yes, and if you'd like to be on, just give us a call.
Just give us a call.
No, when Chris texted me about this and alerted me to it, I said, well, what will Stephen King do now with all of his time?
But really, like for writers, it took a lot of work. Like for writers to read other people's books to then write the blurb, and then for writers to be seeking somebody to do their blurbs. As the publisher said, he'd rather have, his name is Sean Manning. He's publisher of Simon & Schuster's flagship imprint. He's the one who said, let's just not require this anymore. They also noted in some articles I read about it that some of their bestsellers that they've had in recent years were not blurbed at all by anyone. And that's what he had found going back in time, looking through their huge backlist and history. A lot of the bestsellers that are now classics from days gone by did not have any blurbs on them.
Yeah, and the author Rebecca Mackay and Jamie Attenberg, I've read both of their opinions on this. And both of them talked about the amount of time it takes. If you really want to give a thoughtful blurb, particularly, you know, if it's a friend of yours. And they both said it's somewhere between 10 to 12 hours if you really want to do a thoughtful blurb.
Absolutely. I mean, you need to read the book and think about it and think about what's going to engage a potential reader.
Yeah.
Right.
And then, so imagine even if you just do one a month, how much of your own writing time and your own personal reading time that you're giving over to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what the publisher said. He wants his writers to focus on writing.
Right.
Which, like, yes, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. So I also read another mystery thriller, I guess technically a suspense novel, The Vanishing Kind by Alice Henderson. This is her next book in her Alex Carter series. It's coming out March 4th. So thank you to NetGalley and William Morrow for the advance reader copy. So for those of you who don't know Alice Henderson's Alex Carter series, Alex Carter is a wildlife biologist who is in different areas of the country studying a certain endangered species to find out if they're present in the area, how healthy they are, what their range might be, and things like that. This book is set in New Mexico, and the species being studied are jaguars.
Beautiful.
Yeah, really beautiful. In this book, whew, I mean, it's another one that is very much about what's going on in the United States today. There's the animals, but there's also immigrants coming from the southern border, humanitarian activists, white supremacists, a rich white guy who has way too much time and money on his hands and is doing awful things all over the world. And Alex herself is dealing with a lot more humans in this book. In a lot of her books, she's way off in the wilderness with maybe just slight communication with one or two people. In this area, even though like she's in a protected wilderness, it butts up though against ranches and things. So there's the rich guy who has property, and then there's a husband and wife couple who are ranchers who are trying to work with the environment and work with the wildlife. Because one of the things is with that border wall going up between the United States and Mexico, it's interfered with wildlife tremendously. A lot of people may not know that the Real ID Act, it gave the Department of Homeland Security the power to ignore all existing federal, state, and local environmental laws when constructing the border walls. So it's really had a huge impact, not just on humans, but on all other animals as well. So yeah, white supremacist, there's Alex. She's in a log cabin in the mountains in New Mexico, looking for jaguars. What I like about Alice Henderson's novels is that she brings in some of the technology that wildlife biologists use and that she herself uses when she's in the field because she does similar work in real life. So you have that authentic feel about it, but she doesn't get bogged down by it. But I highlighted a couple things to look up later, like, ooh, what's that generator she's talking about? Like a solar powered generator and a solar sun heated shower, which would be nice when you're off camping or in the woods. But yeah, it's a rough book. Like, it's probably the most violent of her books so far. Alex goes through some heavy-duty, horrific things in this book. And I don't want to give any spoilers of any kind, but I really admire her novels, and I feel like I learn a lot. At the end of all of her books, Alice lists how you can help that species directly and then helping the environment in general. And as she talked about federally, the federal government moves really slowly when it moves at all in the right direction. And she's really trying to support people and saying locally is where we need to really concentrate our efforts. Like, everything needs to be effort, but locally we can make our voices heard. We can also help. She gives websites where you could do like citizen scientist type things, even from the comfort of your own home on your computer. A point that she makes is also to investigate what projects your banks are supporting. Yes, which is something I never, ever thought about. So a really gripping novel. If you like the great outdoors, if you're concerned about animals go through some rough thing in this book too, like Alex, the character, does. but no one is really harmed, like the animals, but you're worried about them. So I just want to put that out there for those who might not want to go there. But again, nobody is injured or hurt in that way. The Vanishing Kind, Alice Henderson. If you're already a fan, you will like this one. Be prepared. Alex goes through the ringer. And if you are not aware of Alice's books, I think you could jump in at any point. There are some characters within her world that reappear at certain times. So maybe starting with the first is good. And, this is coming out in March, so you have a few weeks to read her first. What is this one? Is this her fourth? Yes, this is her fourth.
It's the fourth. I was going to say third. Wow. And Alice Henderson has been a guest on the podcast as well.
Yes, Alice was a guest on episode 141.
And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. We might have to call this the series episode because I read Fortune Favors the Dead by Stephen Spotswood. This is the first novel in a Pentecost and Parker mystery. OMG. I loved this book. I kept turning to the gentleman caller saying, I love this book so much. Oh my gosh. It did take a little dip in the bath, but that didn't prevent me from being able to continue reading it. I tried to get the e-version and the audiobook, and they both had long holds. Oh. And this book came out in 2020. So it's definitely popular. I found out about this book from the publisher, Vintage Crime. Thank you. They reached out to us because the fifth book in the series actually just came out this week, February 4th. But I said, hey, can you send the first book in the series? And she was like, do you want me to send them all? I said, sure. Well, I'm going to be reading them all. I'm here to tell you. These are such great characters. It's a Private Eye series. I'm somebody that had a poster of Magnum P.I. on my wall as a kid. I love Tom Selleck, but I also just love the show. I love A Private Investigator. So Lillian Pentecost is a lady gumshoe. And it's about Lillian Pentecost and her partner, Willow Jean Parker, also known as Will. And the novel opens with the sentence, the first time I met Lillian Pentecost, I nearly caved her skull in with a piece of lead pipe. And that was in 1942. And Will is working at the circus, but ends up moonlighting, watching out over this warehouse, and that's where she's holding this lead pipe. Lillian Pentecost comes to have a conversation with somebody, shocks Will, and Will almost bashes her over the head with a pipe. Fast forward, the next chapter starts 3 years later, 1945, where Will is now her assistant, and they're living in a house together. The characters are so good, Chris. I loved it so much. They are tasked in this story with solving the crime of Abigail Collins' death, bludgeoned to death by a crystal ball, which is a slightly unusual weapon.
Indeed.
I was surprised very quickly on page 48 when people think she was murdered by the ghost of the father, which is her husband.
Interesting.
So I was like, alas, is this going to be a ghost story? One of the things I like about this book is there's a list of the characters with descriptions of them at the beginning, and he does that with every book. And Ariel Balustrade is a medium and spiritual advisor to the Upper East Side and says she can speak with the dead, but is she leaving bodies in her wake? And so this is an interview that Lillian is having with Ariel, and Ariel says, I don't like that word, ghost. The connotation it has with ghost stories, that their purpose is to frighten us. We don't need to be afraid of the dead. That's what my grandmother taught me. So I was like, oh, ghosts are popping up in this novel. Great characters. They do solve the crime, but I will just say I didn't really care about that part. It was more the wonderful relationship between Lillian and Will and the placement in time in New York City. It's very New York. It's queer, which surprised me in a wonderful way. His writing is so fantastic, particularly the way he describes people and things. Cannot recommend this series enough. Thank you to the publisher. I had no idea it existed. Fortune Favors the Dead by Stephen Spotswood. won the Nero Award, first book in the series. On the front, it's blurbed by Tana French, razor-sharp style, tons of flair, a snappy sense of humor, and all the most satisfying elements of a really good noir novel. Yeah, very, very good.
Nice blurb. So I finished an audiobook, How to Be Brave, Decisive Moments in Life and Faith. This is by Bishop Mariann Edgar Budde. She's the Episcopal Bishop of Washington. And if her name rings a bell, well, it rings a bell more recently because at a recent prayer service, she spoke the gospel and the words of Jesus and asked the new Trump administration to have mercy on people who are frightened, immigrants and LGBTQ people and others who are being actively threatened by the new administration. So her name is hugely popular. This book is on back order. Like immediately it went on back order. So I listened to the audio and purchased it via Libro, which is another one of our affiliates who also supports independent bookstores around the country. Now, her name was also familiar prior to more recent weeks because in June 2020, when Trump did that photo op in front of St. John's Church by holding a Bible upside down after threatening to use the military against citizens, she spoke out against that and said that using the church as a backdrop for political statements, especially such as are antithetical to the Christian church, was wrong. She became very much in the news then. And then after that, she wrote this book, How to Be Brave.
Okay, so the book came out after that.
The book came out after that. Yeah, so How to Be Brave first was published in 2023. In part because of that, she became a more internationally known figure. I mean, she's the bishop of a major denomination in Washington, D.C., so she's well known already, but that pushed her onto an international forum. So this book, How to Be Brave, has different chapters that focus on different times when we need to be brave for ourselves, for others. And the chapters are deciding to go, deciding to stay, deciding to start, accepting what you do not choose, stepping up to the plate, the inevitable letdown, and the hidden virtue of perseverance. And what I really enjoyed about this audiobook is she reads it herself. You know, she's not like a fiery preacher, but she can tell a story and she reads the prose very well. I enjoyed listening to her. But she has examples from her own life and other people's lives that are in the news or have been, like Madeleine Albright. And then also takes examples from literature and history, which is wonderful, like from Harry Potter. And then Good to Great, Jim Collins, is a business book from a couple decades ago that was very influential. Martin Luther King, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and then Rachel Hold Evans is also mentioned in here. And she was a Christian writer who passed away unexpectedly at a very young age, tragically, whose books I've been interested in, and I've read one and I might read another one soon. But using examples from her own life and her own stumbles was really good to hear. If you saw her giving that sermon, was it a sermon or a prayer? You think, wow, here's somebody finally speaking truth to power in a very big way. But she has stumbled a lot along the way, as any leader does. And I mean, that's what leadership is learning from your mistakes. But I want to read a paragraph for you, Emily Fine. I think you might appreciate this. I went for a swim at the local recreation center with this quandary on my mind. As I was doing laps, clarity finally came, like the proverbial light bulb I had been praying for. I knew without a doubt that the best decision was to stay on campus, focus on essentials, and enjoy the last weeks of seminary. Relief energized me, and I finished my workout strong and confident. But no sooner had I stepped out of the pool and began to dry off than all the uncertainty returned, overtaking the confidence I had just felt moments before. The letdown came so quickly that I burst out laughing. Then it dawned on me that I could either trust what had happened in the pool or heed the rush of doubt that followed. In what felt like an act of faith, I chose to go with my experience in the water. The decision itself has long since faded in significance. Yet the memory of receiving the gift of clarity, followed by an immediate sense that it was an illusion, helped me navigate the same swing of emotion when the stakes have been much higher.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And I was wondering if you could talk about your own experiences with that, because I know part of your swimming is physical, but also you have an emotional aspect, if I'm not being TMI here.
No, I mean, I think swimming, what I've finally come to understand, particularly lap swimming in a pool, you can let your thoughts go because you're not open water swimming and trying to like stay alive, or not be killed by a boat, is it's very meditative. And I cannot tell you how many problems I have solved, both emotionally and also literal, like math problems I'm trying to figure out for a client or something like that, because I think you can access a different part of your brain. It's forcing breath, which I think is one of the most important parts about swimming, because I believe most of us walk around not taking full breaths most of the day. So it forces breath, oxygenating your brain, and you can access different thoughts and patterns. Yeah, it's so well said. And I love, like, the minute she steps out the pool, it's like, what, where did that go? And Chris, my buddy across the table here, gave me a waterproof pad and pen that I take to the pool because I cannot tell you how quickly it escapes you. As soon as you walk out, just like she's saying, to the locker room, it's like, wait a minute, I solved that big problem, but I can't remember it. So, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I thought you'd like that. It made me think about you right away. And
Thank you.
I was reading that from the ebook. When bookshop.org announced that they were doing ebooks now, I downloaded that book as an ebook as well because I wanted to be able to search quotes like that and then also have the bibliography and probably read some sections again, because maybe it was the inevitable letdown. That chapter, I was washing dishes and stuff, and I know I zoned out a little bit. But a lot of good wisdom in here, and it was a very encouraging book to listen to during the last week, that's for sure. The ebook doesn't have an index, which disappointed me, but I wonder if the physical book has an index, because it does bother me when nonfiction doesn't have an index.
Yeah.
I think indexes are so important and would be really helpful in this book with different issues that are going on and subjects that are threaded throughout the book as well. But really enjoyed this one so much. Again, this is How to Be Brave, Decisive Moments in Life and Faith by Mariann Edgar Budde, Episcopal Bishop of Washington. And you don't need to be a Christian to enjoy this book, I don't think. She does use biblical examples. She also had a very great relationship with a rabbi who does a lot of coaching of faith leaders. And so she brings in a lot of different religious traditions, but then again, a lot of secular literary examples as well.
And can I ask a follow-up on the ebook from bookshop.org? You said at the beginning that you can download and read on your phone, but can you also put the app on like a tablet?
Yes.
Okay.
It's on my iPad.
Okay.
And when I ordered it, you order it like you order anything else online. I immediately got an email from bookshop.org saying, your purchase, blah, blah, blah. And then I also got an email from Breakwater Books, who is the bookstore that I have connected to my account. It's our local independent bookstore here in Guilford, Connecticut. An automatic email from them thanking them for my purchase and supporting independent bookstores. So it was very seamless. I think it might have been a little cheaper on other sites. I'm not really sure, but a couple dollars for the freedom to not be associated with a huge conglomerate is nice. And one of the reasons I love bookshop.org and Libro, that they are supporting independence.
Yeah.
That's
great. I'll have to try it. Well, I finished My Life in Food by Julia Child with Alex Prud'homme, who was her co-writer, and he is Paul Child's grandnephew. Paul was Julia's husband. I both listened to this and read it. It was narrated by Kimberly Farr. I mostly listened to the audiobook, but I have to say you have to pick up the paper copy because the photographs in this are so amazing of Julia as a younger woman in her early days in France, all the way through, I think the last photograph, she's older and holding two beautiful baguettes and just looks so gorgeous. It focused on her years in Paris from 1948 to 54, but does go all the way to the end of her husband Paul's life, which was much later, and expands to her move in Cambridge when they come back to the United States. I feel like it was a really great portrayal of the itinerant lifestyle of working for the government, because her husband Paul works for the Foreign Service. They moved around a lot because of that, but it also gave them the opportunity to live overseas and fall in love with Paris. And I just loved her stories of their early apartments and her falling in love with cooking and going to the Cordon Bleu, and then meeting these two women who were already writing a cookbook about French food and French cooking for the American market, but soon realized they needed an American to help them with the writing so it would make sense to American cooks. And how many friggin' years they worked on that cookbook.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, such stick-to-itiveness. Just amazing. And also, I feel like it painted a really clear understanding of her marriage and how much she benefited from the fact that Paul had a day job. And he, too, was an artist wannabe. He was a photographer and was doing a lot of work that he didn't love in order to support their lifestyle. And they ate so much good food, and the descriptions of food are amazing. She paints a very clear picture of her experience with the publishing industry, which was not seamless, and then also her years in television and what that experience was like. I also have to say that it was comforting to read this right now because she talks a lot about McCarthyism. Her father was a devout conservative and was very unhappy with Julia's choice in husband and her liberal ways, which he thought she was made more liberal by her years living in Europe, he was sure. I thought it was really interesting how she had to kind of not spend as much time with her family because of that, but that she and Paul did such a good job of developing this circle of friends and chosen family that they spent a lot of good years with. I loved it so much. Highly recommend. I read it for the Cherry Bomb Book Club, so I'll be attending a Zoom conversation in the future with Alex Prud'homme as the guest.
Oh, that's
Looking
wonderful.
that.
That's really cool. Yeah, I love that one too. I read that and really enjoyed it. Yeah, you know, the whole thing about politics dividing families is nothing new in American culture. I mean, it goes back to the Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, man. So I read a ghost story called The Inn by Guy De Maupassant, a French writer. And it's a very short story. But what attracted me to it was that it is about caretakers in a mountain lodge during the winter when the owners leave and these two caretakers and their dog are left to caretake the place, right? So it's an older man and a younger man. The older man's been the caretaker there for a while. His old fellow caretaker is no longer doing it because he's too old to assume the duties. So hence, it's this young man's first year doing it, and he has a dog. Huge snow, you know, lots of isolation. So the older man says to the younger one, you just have to acknowledge the circumstances and just acknowledge it, right? So I don't want to give spoilers, but something happens. The young man, off the bat, he walks down with the family to a certain level, and then every day he goes back to that certain level and looks down on the village because they're in the Swiss Alps, you know, huge, so tall, and you can see a village way down below. And he does that every day until the snow is too much and you can't even see anything in the village there because everything is snow covered. So then he is in this little room with the other caretaker. They play games. They have the dog who is very joyful. And one night, one of the men goes out and doesn't come back. And the other one has experiences. Just put it that way. Content warning for animal abuse and death, animal death. That was hard to take, but it's a very short story. And it was mentioned in an article I'd read about The Shining by Stephen King. Because Guy De Maupassant was a 19th century writer, so this is an older story. I'm sorry, I don't know where my notes went for this story, so I can't tell you what year it was originally published.
perfect time to read it. We're having a real winter here in New England, so that must have been fun to read it in the winter.
Finally. Yeah, and it was nice that it was short.
Well, we had a joint read of Afterlives on Biography and the Mysteries of the Human Heart by Megan Marshall. She also happens to be the author spotlight at the end of this episode. We both loved this book so much. This is a book of essays that she wrote. She also has a great introduction that talks about some of the documents and how she came to start being interested in writing short form. Part of that had to do with the fact that it was the pandemic, and part of it had to do with the fact that she was grieving the loss of her partner. She's not known for her short form writing. Her biographies are very long. The Peabody sisters took her 20 years to write because she was raising a family at the time. I just love these stories so much.
Yes, I did too. They answered some questions from some of her biographical work that she's done. So the afterlives aspect, there are different afterlives, right? It's her afterlife after losing her partner, her afterlife with some of these historical figures that she was writing biographies on. You know, like she said, like it's the loose ends that she had with some of the subjects and new information that comes up that she discovers or that a reader shares with her or that another scholar uncovers. And then there were afterlives with other people. The other stories have afterlives as well.
And then there are objects that also have afterlives, one of which was a writing desk that she comes to own.
Oh my gosh, that was amazing. That I loved like the follow-up to the Peabody sisters on some of these things. It really made me excited. And then to learn more about Megan's own life experience, like the chapter in Tokyo when she was there for a semester.
Yeah, and also we learned about her as a young person. She was the salutatorian of her high school class, and she had to turn in her speech before she was to give it at graduation. And they said, you are not allowed to give that speech because it was political.
And she found a way.
And she did, because she's a rebel, we came to find out by reading this book.
Such a good book. I didn't know what to expect, really. I have to say the way she combines biography and memoir really made me think about the potential for both forms and to have this kind of hybrid form. And really, like, for the biographer to insert herself into her work, because that's one thing she talks about is that she was getting frustrated with this artificial wall against biographers putting themselves in the biography.
We highly recommend it. It was our giveaway book for a lucky patron this month, and the book is in the mail.
Get your hands on this book through the library or pick up a copy at your local bookstore. Order it if you need to. I think it's going to be on my top 10 list for this year because it really, I'm still thinking about the essays.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And enjoy our conversation with her at the end of this episode.
And then our other joint read was our first ghost story from the Penguin book of ghost stories, The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. And this was a story that was first published in 1852 in Charles Dickens magazine. And we were thinking about, like, how are we going to talk about these ghost stories for this year? There are 19 stories in this book. We know some people are reading along with us. Thank you for those of you who are. We're going to try not to do spoilers, is what we've decided. Certainly not the big spoiler that usually happens in a ghost story.
I would just like to say, in an overarching way, I did discover that I don't particularly like to read a ghost story right before bed. Yeah. I was reading it at night and I had about 3 pages to go and I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to finish this in the morning, which I did. So that is one thing that I have noted for the next 18 stories. I will start them in the day. So we have had people participating in our Goodreads thread, which we started. So if you are reading along with us and would like to have an online conversation, please feel free to go there anytime. That thread stays up 24/7. And we thought maybe we'd start with a question from one of the listeners who read the book.
So that's really funny. You talk about not reading it at night. Robin G. from Sacramento wrote in and said, love the Gaskell story. I hope I'm not tempting fate by reading these at night. Great atmospheric read with a perfectly creepy haunted house. I'm never getting a piano. But then Robin L., also from California, wrote in with a question wondering about the very beginning and her brain hurting from trying to figure out the Furnivall family tree. The main characters go to stay at the Furnivall family manor. And that beginning part is really kind of convoluted. The first couple pages where the narrator, who is she's an old woman at this point, narrating the story, telling a story to the children of the woman who she was nurse and maid to, and is growing up herself pretty much with this woman. And they go to live at this manor because her parents die. So in the very first few pages, you get who's who and what. There's Lord Furnivall, and then people die. There are a couple names mentioned. So I did try to plot things out. I'm showing Emily my little family tree. But I think what confuses us is that Lord Furnivall, there's the old Lord Furnivall and then the new one, because I think those names don't change. Like when the Lord dies or the lady, the next in line assumes the title.
Right. They don't say junior or second or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a little confusing. But I think it was also confusing, maybe intentionally, because I was thinking about this being published in Charles Dickens magazine. And I feel like a lot of Charles Dickens novels in the beginning are confusing. You're not really sure what's going on. And then eventually you kind of do. And you might have to go back and look and see, like, who is that again? And how are they introduced? But then I changed my mind because I said to Robin, like, well, maybe the family tree isn't all that important because the rest of the story is really clear. The prose is very clear. You don't get confused about what's going on. And it's mainly about these women. So maybe the family tree doesn't matter. But then when I was looking at my notes and I was rereading that first section, the fear of inherited insanity is mentioned. And I was like, whoa. So maybe the family tree matters more than I thought.
Yeah, or I think it could also just be interpreted that you recognize you've brushed up against insanity and you realize that I personally think there's insanity in every family. So I think it could be interpreted either way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I had to reread it at the beginning because I think you also forget that it's being told as a tale.
To kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's that question, too, of like the spook factor of like telling a ghost story, right?
Right. Yeah. Because even the narrator even says at one point, she's like, oh, I can see that you're not interested in this part. When she is talking about the family tree, basically, and her mother or their mother. That's a really interesting point.
I really liked it. I thought it was very fun to read. It is creepy. I mean, the house part is really creepy, and it's winter, and there's like scary footprints, and there's a whole part of this manor that's locked that nobody goes to, which totally creeps me out.
Yeah, like the manor has these different wings, and so the east wing is kind of off.
Right, for all those people who live in houses with wings.
Yes,
you know, like
for different family members who don't get along.
Right.
Yeah, it involves a haunting, and I think it's one of those stories that does well with a second reading because you can then see like all of these things that were dropped. Yeah. Little clues about what is going on. In the introduction to this book, the Penguin Book of Ghost Stories, the person writing the intro talks about how some of these stories are placed in borderlands between like England and Scotland, or, you know, different areas, which is something I don't pick up on because I'm not all that great with the detailed geography of the UK, which I'm going to get because I thought it might be fun to plot these stories out on a map or something to learn about that. So that borderland thing. And then I was thinking about national traditions and how some areas of even like the United States have more hauntings for different reasons than others. But then there is also the element of the fear of the foreigner that is introduced in the story in the form of the music teacher. Yes. Who is problematic, to say the least.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
I love a short story. I enjoyed it very much, and I'm curious to see where these stories take us as we go. I also wanted to just say that in the back, I did flip back and forth a lot. There's explanatory notes is what they call them here, that I found very interesting. I mean, that they do also have in the back a little bit something about each of the authors, which was helpful. It places them in time and you understand about what they've written. They tell you when the short story was originally published. And then these explanatory notes that pop up throughout the story, which I felt was really helpful. And part of it, like you're saying, does place you where they are. Mm-hmm. So this one took place in Westmoreland, a former county in the northwest of England in the area of the Lake District. In 1974, Westmoreland was merged with the neighboring country of Cumberland to form Cumbria. So I think that was really helpful as well.
Yeah, and there's also a glossary of Scots words. Yes. Which is really interesting. It's so funny because one of the words in particular, bairn, I was like, oh, I know that from Outlander.
That's great.
Yeah, and then in the beginning, there's a chronology of the ghost story, which is kind of helpful because it does throw in some American writers. I mean, it starts with Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820, which is really interesting to think about. And, you know, they're talking about the ghost story as a genre. It started in the 1820s and its height was in the mid-19th century, and then the Victorians did their special things with it in the later 19th century, but that there's always been scary stories. But this book is talking about the genre of the short story as a format. It's interesting to think about that. And even the short story as a form, for me, it's just like it's a given. But to think about the development of a form is interesting, and how magazines, the growth of the magazine and newspapers contributed, especially magazines, contributed to the rise of the short story in general.
And still are a great resource for finding them. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, everyone, that was The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell.
The first story in our year of reading from the Penguin Book of Ghost Stories. And reminder that we do have a reading schedule, and we will post that on the Ghost tab on our website.
Our next ghost story will be coming up March 4th. Episode 229, Fitzjames O'Brien's What Was It? So yes, if you would like to contribute questions or comments that you'd like us to ponder, please get those to us by March 4th.
So we can talk about it.
Yes, because we love everybody's input, or just like how the story impacted you and affected you. And I wonder too, like, this story deals with women. I mean, there's men involved. But I also wonder about gendered reactions.
Yeah, because this one has domestic violence, which is a little bit of a spoiler.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about this when I told you about that there are some spoilers in Ruth Franklin's biography of Shirley Jackson. But one of the things is you probably forget them unless you're reading the book right away. Like, if I were to pick up some Shirley Jackson stories that I haven't read yet, there's no way I'm going to remember what Ruth Franklin wrote about at all because it was years ago. But I think that you'd be better off reading her stories and then reading the chapter in the biography, just because you're doing it so close to each other, back to back. This episode is sponsored by
The Left Hand. Jan Hendricks grew up as a rural farm girl. During the jazz club era of the late 1940s, she starts college in the big city of Billings, Montana. She meets the charming Lavio Rossano, who sweeps her off her feet. Jan soon learns something unusual about Lavio's profession. He is connected with a crime family and needs someone behind the scenes to do his dirty work, the left hand. This romantic period crime thriller from debut author Brittany J. Sears is available now. Check the show notes for more information. Should we talk about Biblio Adventures?
Oh, Biblio Adventures. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a very quick one to talk about that's kind of almost a follow-up, which is I did watch The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse, which was the short film based on the book by Charlie Mackesy that I read and loved. And unbeknownst to me, it won the 2023 Oscar for Best Animated Short Film.
Oh, cool.
I was able to watch it on Apple TV. I think it's available on Prime as well. I don't know if you could get it as a DVD from the library, but that's a possibility. The book was better. I mean, it won an Academy Award, so who am I to give a review? But I thought it was lovely. If you wanted to watch it with a child, it would be really nice. It was beautiful to watch. I just thought that I got more out of the reading of the book than I did the movie.
Well, I attended the Woman's Prize Book Club. It was a conversation between Sarah Waters and Simon Savage, and I had a wonderful experience. I couldn't watch it live because I was working, but it was a paid event, so those who paid were able to access the recording for a month, I think it is, because this is all going to support the Women's Prize, which is an important thing. So Sarah Waters and Simon had a really wonderful conversation. It lasted about an hour, I believe, and it was Simon's first time reading the book, so that was fun. So it was very fresh and new for him. One of the surprising things that Sarah said is she takes a long time to write. There's years and years between her novels, and people are always hungry for another Sarah Waters novel. So she actually said she'd been working on a novel for a very long time. She said, I'm not going to tell you how long, but she recently decided to stop it and put it away because it just wasn't working.
Wow.
Yes. So it was kind of like I wasn't in the room, but you felt the energy go,
Right.
No.
Could we just read it and tell you if we think you should stop it?
But what she did say she was interested in and thinking about are some ghost stories she'd like to write. Can you believe that?
Oh, my gosh.
I was like, my jaw hung open. I was like, no way. No way.
That's amazing.
Yeah, she's not a short story writer, but that's what she is looking into right now. So I think she'd be a great short story writer, a great ghost story writer, because she does creepy very well. So we will be keeping our eyes out for that. Tipping the Velvet was her first novel and one of my absolute favorite all-time novels. I love it so much. And she referred to it as a lesbian fantasy history. And I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what it is. Exactly what it is. And one of the reasons I love it so much, because she says the Victorian era is like ripe for lesbian picking, but they didn't write about things blatantly, openly, as we do now today. And as a lesbian, like, I want that. Like, I want to see myself in history. So that was neat to hear her talk about and writing it for herself. After that, Sean and I of Sean Breathes Books had another little conversation about our reaction to that, and then he's combining that with the conversation we had about Fingersmith, and we'll be posting that on his YouTube channel sometime soon. We'll let you know when that video goes live so you could check it out. In the meantime, I highly recommend Fingersmith by Sarah Waters.
Awesome. Well, we went on an amazing joint jaunt this week to New York City.
Yes, our first time back, we think, since our earthquake Biblio adventure last year in May, I think that was.
Right. For those of you who don't know about that, we were on the train to New York City when there was an earthquake, and we decided, just as the train was going to be going underground, that perhaps we should get off, and we disembarked the train at the Harlem platform and decided to go back up to New Haven and went to the Beinecke instead.
Yes, and that was a fun Biblio adventure day. But it was really fun to be back in the city together. I think we've been there individually, but it was great to be back together because we have so much fun just hanging out in the city, eating good food. And I mean, books are just everywhere in the city.
Indeed. But our destination this time was the New York Society Library, which is about 2 miles north of Grand Central Station. It was a cold, wintry day, but sunny, so we decided to walk up, which was lovely. And we were going there for two different things.
Yes, we were going to watch a webinar with Ruth Franklin talking about her new book,
The Many Lives of Anne Frank, which just came out.
Yeah, and this was through Yale, and you had to register. I would think it's available on their YouTube channel. We'll have to check that out, and if it is, we'll put a link in the show notes.
It was actually sponsored by the Yale Program for the Study of Anti-Semitism, we should say. And also the book was published by the Yale University Press.
Yes. I mean, we are Ruth Franklin fans already from the work that she's done on Shirley Jackson in particular. And so what Ruth wanted to do with this book was she talked about that Anne is such an icon and she's such a symbol for various groups around the world. And that the more symbolic she became, the less we actually knew about her as a human being. And so what Ruth does in this book is combine her humanity, her humanness, with the symbolic that she is, because she said there's nothing wrong with her being a symbol, but she was also an actual person.
Right. I really appreciated how she said that. And she talked about the writing process and how she was trying to figure out how to come up with the structure of the book. We should say that the gentleman talking with her, his name was Maurice Samuels. One of his first questions was about the structure. And she said, I was actually a few years into my research and standing in line at the airport and had an aha moment and figured out how to structure the book.
Yeah.
Just goes to show writing takes place everywhere, not just behind the computer or at your pen and paper.
Yeah. And one of the surprising things for me to learn about was Anne's father's involvement in the publishing of her diaries, because I was taught that Otto Frank, her father, really edited her diary quite heavily to make himself look better and to take things out. And that is absolutely not the case at all. Anne said that he was really unfairly demonized, and it's absolutely not true. He didn't edit out things about himself, but that Anne had this very personal diary, like a diary that anyone would keep, right, about what's going on with your day. But that she had heard a radio announcement, somebody saying, like, we need to write our stories. We need to have a record of what's been going on during this time. And then rewrote her diary.
Right. I mean, there were so many misconceptions that I realized as she was talking about that, because I always thought that Anne's diary was like found, you know, like nobody knew she had been writing this and her father found it and then it was published. But actually she had already been editing her own diary thinking it would be eventually used for people to read.
Right. And so like Anne actually edited out her romance that she had with a young man in the annex, and her father added that back in. So the stuff that she cut, he put back in with a little bit more. Well, when she was rewriting it, she added context so that readers would understand more. But then she did cut out some of that personal stuff that he put back in to really, again, help humanize her more.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. And Ruth was sitting in her home office for the conversation, and she held up a book that she used that showed the 3 different levels. So it showed Anne's original diary entry, showed Anne's revised diary entry, and then showed the entry that had then been revised by her father. It was really interesting.
Yes. Oh my God. So fascinating. It really was. It really blew my mind, because everything that I thought about it, like you're saying, was wrong.
Yeah.
All of these old myths. And, you know, that's a question I often have about, and people ask too, I'm not the only one with this question, but like when you're interested in a figure, what biography should you read? Because some of the older ones could have a lot of misinformation.
Right.
You know, like that things that were based on mythologies that were not based on fact, and subsequent scholars have uncovered documentation about things, and so it can get really tricky.
I mean, neither of us have had the opportunity to read this book yet. We do have a copy, thank you to Yale University Press, and I plan to dig into it. But that's one of the things Ruth said, is she didn't want to write a cradle-to-grave biography, and that this structure that she designed has 13 different ways of looking at Anne as different aspects of her life. And then she titled each chapter based on the perception of her, of that particular thing she's writing about.
Yeah. And she did mention 3 other biographies that she would recommend. I think it was Melissa Mueller, Carolyn Lee, and Francine Prose. All have different types of biographies about Anne Frank.
And we should also say that Ruth just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this, and I'll put a gift link in the show notes if you'd like to read it.
Yeah, really fascinating. Yeah. I mean, she's just so well-spoken and intelligent and compassionate. I feel like she truly is one of those people I could listen to talk forever about her subjects.
And poor thing had a cold and a really bad cough and a frog in her throat the whole conversation. She was a trooper drinking tea.
It made me think one of the things they talked about toward the end is just how Anne was kind of made to kind of look like a quasi-Christian is the word that was used, and the American tendency to make things so universal that it kind of takes out the particular, and that when the diary first came out in the United States, it was actually marketed as a Christmas present, and that they played down her Jewishness, which is really obviously an anti-Semitic thing to do.
Yeah.
But I was really surprised by Anne having listened to that radio announcement talking about writing down your stories, because a few years ago I read about the Oneg Shabbat archive, which was an archive collected by the community of Jews that were in the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II. And now I'm curious about how many communities and people heard that call to like tell your story, because no one else will.
No one else will, and also no one will have your perspective, right?
Yeah.
You know, she had a very particular perspective on what was happening in her life at her age, and so, really, really interesting. Well, we should say that the New York Society Library had a great exhibit of 30 years of the New York City Book Awards, which we enjoyed, and they had a shelf in one of the rooms with each of the books, and we were thrilled to see some books that we knew there, and the exhibit was really cool, and it was on the floor entering the room to an event that we were there to participate in the evening, which was a reading of Byron's Manfred performed by the New Relic Theater.
Yeah, we were attracted to this because Manfred is partially a ghost story. It was a great location to be in this historic room and see a reading of something by Byron.
Yeah, I think I'm going to speak for you. Our conversation as we walked out of the building was, I didn't really understand it very well. You realize when you're at home watching television and you have closed captions on or subtitles. I would have liked to either have had a copy of it in my hand so I could follow along with them. Like I could hear them and all of that. I just felt like I couldn't quite follow the story. And it really was just a reading. They weren't acting things out very much. There were very few props. And so at one point I just decided I'm just going to let these words wash over me. And there were some beautiful turns of phrase and I enjoyed it, but I can't say that I 100% followed the story.
Right. Yeah, same. Yeah. I mean, it was some guy who was calling forth spirits and then spirits come, and I couldn't really tell you much more either because I had the same experience of, I mean, I thought at first that I would like try and read it because it's based on an epic poem of his, this drama. But yeah, it was long monologues, and just being read. So it was kind of hard to follow any quote action.
Right. At one point, one of the women put like a silvery tool sheath over her head, and I was like, "Oh, the ghost," you know. But I think she was weather. I couldn't quite figure it out. So.
Yeah. There was like the main guy, and then 3 ghosts, and some other person. But at one point, somebody sang beautifully.
Yes,
a few lines, and that was just like really beautiful to hear. And that the ceilings are tall, huge ceilings in there.
It was a beautiful setting to hear it, even if I didn't understand it all the way. But it was a great day. We really enjoyed it. We hopped the train home, and it was so nice to be on a Biblio adventure back in New York City.
Absolutely. It was a great day.
Yes. Do you have any upcoming jaunts, Chris?
Yes, I have one that it's a webinar, so anyone can participate in this. You do have to register. It's a part of the Mondays at the Beinecke program, Becoming Belle DaCosta Green, a visionary librarian through her letters, and this is with Deborah Parker, February 17th, which is a Monday at 4 p.m.
Very cool.
And I'll be able to watch that because I'll be off of work that day because it's President's Day.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so looking forward to that because our next Biblio adventure will probably be going to the Morgan Library to see the Belle DaCosta Green exhibit that they have going on.
And we should say because she was the personal librarian at the Morgan Library.
Yes.
And I mentioned this already, Wednesday, February 12th at R.J. Julia's. Charmaine Wilkerson will be there talking about Good Dirt with Kristen Higgins. I cannot wait to hear her talk about that book. And then February 20th, Jen Bouchard will be at Bank Square Books signing her second novel, her sophomore novel, Considering Us.
Very cool.
And we have a joint Biblio adventure of the read-along conversation, the Zoom conversation for The Haunting of Hill House, which I cannot wait.
And what's the date on that?
Sunday, February 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a couple spots left, so if you're interested and haven't emailed us already and want to participate in the Zoom conversation, email us at bookcougars@gmail.com.
And if you've already said you want to participate and you know you can't, please let us know.
Yes.
That way as well, because we are going to have to cap this one probably.
Yeah.
So what about upcoming reads?
Oh my gosh. I went to the library in West Hartford with the gentleman caller because I don't have enough books to read. And I found a new memoir out by someone I didn't know had a new memoir out. Still Life at 80, The Next Interesting Thing by Abigail Thomas. For those of you who aren't familiar with her, she wrote the memoir, A Three-Dog Life, which is probably one of the best memoirs I've ever read. It's about a time after her husband has a brain injury and she has to kind of establish a new life for herself with her 3 dogs, and it's really good. So when I saw this, I was very excited. I started reading it in the library and knew I had to take it home. And then I also have Jason Reynolds' new YA book, A Love Story, 24 Seconds From Now, which I'm hearing really great things about. It's told from the perspective of a teenage Black boy about what it's like to become sexually active, I think. Mm-hmm. I haven't read any other information about it. I should say it is blurbed with one blurb from the Judy Bloom that says, Jason Reynolds has done it again, but in a totally new way. His take on Neon's first time with Arya, his true love, is fresh from start to finish. Who wouldn't want a first-time partner like Neon? He's tender and sweet and scared and funny. He's a romantic. This is what it could be, should be, if only we were all as lucky as Arya. Girls and everyone, wait for your Neon.
Nice.
And then the other book I got out of the library is The Cheesemaker's Daughter by Christian Vukovic. And this is a debut novel, and it takes place in Croatia. It piqued my interest because I don't know much about their culture or food there. And it's about a young woman who's living stateside but needs to go back to Croatia to help with her family's cheese farm.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
A cheese farm.
I don't know if that's the best way to say it. The sheep farm where they make cheese is probably a better way to say it.
Well, I have a couple things coming up. I mean, one book, I don't know if I'm going to read it, but I figured I would let everybody know, if you haven't heard yet, that Dan Brown has a new book coming out later this year in September 9th, The Secret of Secrets.
I wonder if it was written by his wife a while ago.
I know. We'll see. Another Robert Langdon thriller.
That was mean-spirited. I'm sorry. For those of you who don't know, they went through a terrible divorce, he and his wife, and it came out in the wash that she maybe had helped him write quite a few of his books.
Indeed.
And didn't get any credit.
Right, exactly. So maybe not mean-spirited, maybe just...
Truth-talking?
Truth-talking. I want to read We Were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi Coates. That is one of the books that Bishop Budde mentions in her book several times. So I have a copy on hold at the library. But I also recently ordered a copy of Tales from the Haunted South, Dark Tourism and Memories of Slavery from the Civil War Era. And this is by Taya Alicia Miles, who I really admire her writing. That one's just really interesting to me because Laura and I often talk about one of the ways these old plantation buildings and beautifully landscaped home areas have been preserved is by hosting weddings, and so what does it mean for like these horrific sites to now be places where people go to celebrate the beginning of something, whether they're white or what color they are, but just, I don't know, the meaning of that and all the different levels, politically, spiritually, economically.
I know Clint Smith talks about that.
Oh, yeah. I read his book.
And How the Word is Passed.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great book, too. Yeah. That's one I might actually dip into again because that was very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, coming up next is our conversation with Megan Marshall about her memoir, Afterlives.
I hope you enjoy this. I tried not to be too huge of a fangirl. We are honored today to welcome Megan Marshall, author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, and co-editor of the forthcoming Collected Writings of Margaret Fuller from the Library of America. She's also published biographies on Elizabeth Bishop and the Peabody sisters. Megan is here today to talk with us about her new memoir, Afterlives, on biography and the mysteries of the human heart. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Chris and Emily. I've really enjoyed listening to your show, and I feel excited to be part of it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
Megan, this book was really surprising to me when I started reading it. On the back, it says it's a memoir, but it's actually 7 beautiful braided essays. Can you give the listeners your description of this book?
That's a very good question. It came together over a period of time when I began writing shorter pieces rather than full biographies. It was a time of great change in the world and in my life, and it seemed like the short form was better suited to that. But what was I going to turn my attention to as a biographer? You know, it is in a way a memoir, but also I tend to look at other people rather than myself. So I looked back to my grandparents when they were in World War I in Paris, an amazing story that I hadn't known about until I started reading their papers. I looked into my mother's and my other grandmother's lives. They were all left-handed, the grandmothers and my mother, and began to think about why it was I was drawn to writing about women's lives and the kind of handicaps that women experience just by being women, in the sort of the same way that my left-handed mother and aunts and grandmothers were always, you know, made to write with the right hand instead of the left, or kind of made to feel a bit ashamed for being left-handed. This is another generation from now. And so I started writing these things, and then I began to feel, well, maybe they fall together into kind of a narrative arc. Some of them had to do with questions I hadn't been able to answer when I was writing the biography. So it starts off with an essay called Afterlives, the same title as the book itself. And I had always been puzzled over the fate of the Hawthornes. Sophia Peabody, one of my Peabody sisters, married Nathaniel Hawthorne, and they had 3 children. Their oldest daughter died at 33, kind of mysteriously. And I don't want to really, you know, give much of a spoiler, but bizarrely, this is the biographer's dream, where Sophia Peabody Hawthorne and her daughter Una had died in England around 15 years ago. It was decided that their remains should be transferred from the cemetery in London to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, where Nathaniel Hawthorne was buried, and everybody visits and all of that. Emerson, Thoreau, Alcott's, they're all buried there. And in the process of doing so, I was invited to look inside the coffin at these remains. I'm not going to tell you what I found because that's in the essay, but my goodness, so much to think about and rethink, I guess. That's what the book is about, and the ways that we're all living with history and we're living in history as it's being made. And we don't always appreciate that about our lives. And I think each of these essays gives you a sense of that for me, and something that I think the reader can identify with themselves, their own periods of uncertainty and looking back to ancestors who might lead the way.
That's a great description. The essay that deals with Una and the discoveries that led you to speculations, I was fascinated. I gasped during that essay.
I'm hoping there's a little gasp in every one of these essays.
Yes.
I think there probably is.
Yes. Poetry, it seems, was your first writing love.
Yeah.
You studied with some major American poets at Harvard College. And poetry is really infused throughout this collection of essays, whether you're talking about 19th century poets or even older poets from like the 1200s, I think, in Japan. Could you talk a little bit about your love of poetry?
Yes. I started writing poetry when I was 8 years old and had a little poem published in the kids' corner of the Pasadena Star News where I was growing up. And, I loved reading all kinds of things, but poetry always really seemed to kind of give an essence of feeling. Elizabeth Bishop said poetry is thinking with one's feelings. And I think that's what I'm trying to do in all of the writing that I do. So I was lucky in college to, you had to apply to these workshop classes, and I landed in a workshop class with Robert Lowell and one with Elizabeth Bishop and other lesser known but very influential writers, and I enjoyed learning how every word counts. And that's the sense, that the poet has. And I think every writer who aims to write with some distinctive style has that feeling too. So it prepared me for the later work I did in prose writing and to attend to the writing of others. So I'm always looking out for it. And I think we could talk about two of the different essays where poetry comes in, at least briefly. One is my remembrance, really, of my high school classmate, Jonathan Jackson, who was the younger brother of George Jackson, the leader of the Soledad Brothers. This is in the 1970s. George had been imprisoned for most of my classmate Jonathan's life, and he had one of these strange sentences that they tell a Black teenager is going to work well for them. Just, confess to this crime of stealing $70 and you'll get off. But he didn't really get off. George, this is Jonathan's brother, he got a 1 year to life sentence. And so he was endlessly in prison and becoming radicalized as he read and read. He was quite an intellectual. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you that whole story, but this was growing up in Pasadena, a city of segregated, but, many races living there. And one of the great writers to come out of Pasadena is Octavia Butler. I felt that in writing about the conflicts in Pasadena that led ultimately to Jonathan attempting to free his brother from prison with what was, we can all say now, a kind of misguided attempt to hold up a trial in Marin County and take hostages. And he ended up killed along with the judge and others. And the weapons he had used had belonged to Angela Davis, who was one of the Soledad brothers' great supporters. So this is, if you know about this case at all, you probably know about that Angela Davis was on the FBI's most wanted list because of this. But Jonathan, my classmate, who died at 17, trying to rescue his brother, I think has been forgotten in this. And that's the point of my essay, to bring him back to life and to think about what kind of model of agency or heroism or maybe persuasion against his own interest. What was this all about? It's haunted me ever since 1970, when he was so sadly and needlessly killed. But Octavia Butler has written these wonderful novels. She's thought of as a science fiction writer, but she really wrote in many genres. And I'm sure many of your readers have read the parable novels or Kindred. And she develops in these the Earthseed religion and has the Earthseed poem. We're born into this world not with purpose, but with potential. And she has further lines about, all we know is change. Everything we touch changes, and change changes you. It's a wonderful poem that many people know. You can find it all over the internet. And it seemed to really aptly describe this period for Jonathan and for me, where our lives were changing. The world was changing around us. Everything is change. And we seek to bring the kind of change we want to see to the world, but we can't always do that. We need to accept the impermanence and, to some extent, our powerlessness, which brings me to the second essay I wanted to talk about, in which their poetry figures quite a lot. Some of the essays have a real narrative arc, such as the story of Jonathan Jackson, story of my grandparents in World War I, which, kind of goes from the American entrance into the war, my grandparents' fortunate ability to go as a newlywed couple, and both of them live in Paris while my grandfather worked for the press corps, and that carries through to the armistice, which he managed to witness the reading of the armistice in the Chamber of Deputies in Paris. So those have kind of narrative arcs, but you talk about the braided essay. The essay I'm talking about now is an essay about many things. It's about solitude. It's about mourning. It's about the pandemic, and it's linked to my period of several months where I lived in Kyoto as a visiting professor at Kyoto University and became fascinated by this 12th century monk, Kamo no Chomei, who had lived the court life and seen a lot, seen the corruption of politics. He had witnessed big fires taking over the city of Kyoto. He'd witnessed floods. He'd witnessed epidemics, and he decided to withdraw and established a kind of Thoreauvian hut up in the woods and wrote about that in a book that's called Hojoki, translates as My 10-Foot Square Hut. And unlike Thoreau's Walden, it's a very poetic and relatively short piece of writing. And while I was in Kyoto, I explored. There's a replica of his hut. There's the hut site itself. And I became quite immersed in this Hojoki, which I found a translation that set it in verse and, was very inspiring to me about how to handle this period in my life, in all of our lives. My partner of 15 years was unwell and dying at this time, or when I returned from Kyoto. And thinking back, he died just before the pandemic, and then I began writing this during the pandemic. And as I say in the essay, I had forgotten that there was this passage from the Hojoki. I'll just read a few of the lines. On top of all, a great plague broke out, stood the world upon its head. And then he writes about how loving couples, the one whose love was deeper, always died first. They held back, gave the meager food to their dearest. And I kind of applied that to my partner, Scott, who himself is a poet, and his concern for me above himself as he knew he was dying. That's what that essay, which is called Without, which has many meanings, being without Scott, being, as Kamo no Chomei was in a hut, and being in the without, with the outer world. So thanks for asking about that. And I do find that poetry can be a touchstone in my writing, even if I'm not writing poetry.
Yeah, I was just talking to a friend this morning about how we can help each other right now in the current political climate we're living in. And we both decided that we would start sharing a lot of poetry with each other, because I too find that poetry helps me get through times in my life that sometimes you can't find answers for, but somehow poetry helps you.
Yes, I'll read a little bit more of that full poem. This is from Earthseed. We are born not with purpose, but with potential. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change.
So true. Yeah. And Megan, one thing that was so interesting about reading your book, we're talking to Megan after the big fires in LA.
Yes.
And you have a lot of history in the Pasadena, Altadena area.
I do.
It's in this book quite a bit, and that area's been so affected. Talk about change, and
yes.
I hope everyone is okay. And
well, some friends from high school have lost houses. As I write in the essay about my grandparents who were in Paris leading this very brave life against the war. During the war, they ended up in Altadena and built a little house there in 1923. That's where my father grew up. We spent, dinners. I talk about that in the essay. Of course, I was concerned about the house, not that that's not in my family anymore. And miraculously, this little house at, I won't give you the address, but on Highland Ave in Altadena did survive in a little pocket of houses. It was quite near Eaton Canyon where the fire began, but I'm guessing that the wind was blowing so fiercely that maybe the flames were sort of sent over this little enclave of small, all of them little stucco bungalows. And my family loved this jacaranda tree that grew out in front. And a friend went up recently and took a picture, and I can see the tree is still there, a bit singed, but there's greenery on the leaves. So, everyone I know is just heartbroken, stricken to lose a whole city. And I feel, some kind of survivor guilt about this little house lasting. I wish it were my friend's house. But whoever owns it, I'm happy for them that it's there. But I feel almost as if I because I wrote about it, it stayed. I don't know. It's sort of a magical thing that it is there at all, and so many memories. And I have photos of it when it was first built that I'm now going to send to I don't know who lives in there now, but I'm going to write to them. Anyway, I think that's part of the message of Octavia Butler, as so many people have been saying. She foresaw these wildfires. I mean, that's how the parable stories begin, with having to leave. She doesn't call her town Pasadena, but she calls it Robledo, which is, I think, taken from, there's a main avenue, Los Robles, that runs through the city. The only truth is change.
Yeah. It's really fascinating, too, the connection with your family, with Octavia Butler, that your grandmother may have been the librarian that told stories when she was a child and really inspired her and influenced her own writing.
This is the wonderful thing about looking back and finding connections. You know, I didn't know a lot about Octavia Butler, but in the research for this, I read a number of interviews, and she always talks about going to the Pasadena Central Library, where my grandmother was the children's librarian who told stories. That's really how that essay about Jonathan Jackson begins, with going to story hour with my grandmother, who I didn't really think about it at the time, but she made a point of finding folktales from all over the world, knowing that, you know, the kids who came to the Central Library were from all sorts of backgrounds, African folktales and Latin American folktales. It was just not all Little Red Riding Hood by any means. In fact, I don't think she ever did tell Little Red Riding Hood. And they were just fantastic stories. So when I read not only that the library was important to her, but that a librarian who told stories was the one who introduced her to the children's room. And of course, she, like as I did, kind of grow out of the children's room eventually. But the most wonderful experiences of my childhood as a reader and as a future writer was that, you know, I went to the library to be under my grandmother's care when I was 6 or 7 years old after school, and help her shelve the books and just be, you know, let loose in then the children's room.
That's great.
It's beautiful in Pasadena. I don't know if you've been there, but it's the library, the Central Library, is quite a historic building.
Uh-huh. No way. I have not. Another one to put on the list, though, to make it out there. No, I was just struck by you mentioning the house, your family's house surviving, and the magical thinking. And this is not exactly related completely, but you talk a bit about the shift in history writing and biography, too, into material studies.
Material culture studies, yes.
Yeah, and fascinating. You know, the one essay starts with this ice pick that your dad had. And can you talk a little bit about that? In Altadena, wow.
Yeah, as I said, some of the essays are kind of a narrative. It's clear, you know, what the historical story is, but sometimes they just start from, in this case, an object that I have enjoyed and puzzled over. And so this essay is called These Useless Things, and it's sort of a takeoff on the jazz standard, These Foolish Things. Ella Fitzgerald sings and others. These useless things. Are they really useless? I mean, the ice pick that my father used when he broke up a block of ice to make ice cream, you know, with the ice cream churn, it has on it, you know, the phone number of the ice dealer from Los Angeles from probably the 1930s that would just have handed out these ice picks, you know, as a way of advertising, so that you had the Arctic Ice Company. Okay. The Arctic Ice Company of Los Angeles, locally owned. I just loved what's written on the handle of it. Arctic Ice Company of Los Angeles, locally owned, independent. We sell ice, no sidelines.
I love that.
Arctic Ice Company, safe, sanitary, saving, and then a phone number. So that started me thinking about how, things come to represent the people that we know who held them. It connected me to my father. I remembered all the little things that I used to play with before I could read, buttons and tiles, and I had a box of my grandmother's broken jewelry that to me seemed like a treasure chest. But then I did move on to reading and preferred words to images for a very long time. But as I came to the end of writing these biographies, I emerged into this period of the material culture studies, and where so many people are now writing histories of the world in 100 objects, or, the Bronte cabinet, which is a biography of the Bronte sisters, looking at, I think, 7 or 8 different objects that belong to them. And I thought, what have I been missing here? And I remembered things from my own research that I had kind of skipped over. And then I also happened to be reading, a lot of these things are by chance, began with the ice pick. I happened to be reading with a friend all of John Updike's rabbit novels. And I realized that ice is a big thing for him too, so this launched me into the history of ice making and ice selling, which also took me back to Thoreau, who has a wonderful passage in Walden about when he's hanging out at Walden in late 1840s. And this is exactly the same time that people realized you could harvest ice from a pond. So he's watching all these workmen come out and, cut the blocks and put them under wood chips so that they can be shipped to India and where people need ice. And this leads to, then there's John Updike writing about this small town in Pennsylvania where he grew up, and there was an ice factory that's defunct, but he remembers ice boxes and how the huge ice cube melted and what it looked like. So the essay kind of rambles, but it does lead you to another aha moment, which I think I probably won't reveal.
No, do not reveal. It's worth it in the unfolding. I have to say, when I finished reading that essay, I immediately got in the car and went and got an ice cream cone, Megan, even though it's the dead of winter here and very cold. But you do, this is not a spoiler, but in that essay, you do reminisce about churning ice cream, and one of those old ice cream churners that we had in my family too, and I loved when we would make ice cream in it. So
it certainly tasted different.
Yes.
Oh,
Speaking of ice cream, I keep meaning to go. I've never had it before, but apparently there's a kind of maple soft ice cream that you can get in Vermont, and there's one little store in Cambridge, Massachusetts that makes and sells this, and I keep meaning to go try that, even if it's winter.
Yes, ice cream is good any day. Yes. Well, please report back with pictures if you do end up finding yourself there. We would love to know.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, the essay was so exciting.
Yes.
I just read the Peabody Sisters last year or the year before.
I think it was last year.
I think the year before.
Oh, right. Yeah. We did the year of the Scarlet Letter.
Yeah.
That's right. And you did,
Well, I'll just say, I won't tell you what it is, but there's an actual object that I come across from the Peabody Sisters' lives, which, it's a little bit like also looking in the coffin and seeing Sophia Peabody's remains.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not any skeletons, though, I'll just tell you. Other things. Of even greater interest.
Yes. Oh, my gosh. Yeah. Detective work.
Yes.
The biographer is detective, right? Yeah.
Yes. I think they're all of these, I'm kind of a sleuth, really around the edges of things. And that's what I love in researching biography and researching this book is, again, finding things that you would have expected. And of course, I wanted to phone that number on the ice pick, and there's another discovery related to that.
Yeah. Speaking of detective work, would you like to ask the question about?
Oh, yeah. This is just something that came up because you mentioned in one essay in the early years of you being a researcher and biographer, taking your portable typewriter into the archives to do research. And then, there's the gasps that happen as people are reading archival materials and discover exciting things. And I was just curious, over the course of your career, how has the sounds of research changed? Because in the reading rooms I've been in, they're usually quite quiet. And I was just wondering what having a portable typewriter was like back then. Did a lot of people come in with portable typewriters? Were they noisier places?
No, I really had to fight and argue to get that typewriter in, and only because it was a silent typewriter. It was, trying to think what the make was, but there was just this little kind of tipping period between, the loud Smith Corona or IBM typewriters and portable computers, where this typewriter I had I don't think this one was a Brother, but you might recognize the name of a Brother. Other people had Brother typewriters. It was very quiet. And I would bring it to the archivist and I'd say, this is very quiet. Don't you think this is very quiet? And they'd say, yes, yes. You can bring this in, but everyone else was there with a pencil. You can't use a pen in case you marked up the letter that you were writing on. No, can't risk that. But they did let me have that typewriter there because I think they saw I was going to be there for a very long time. Not all archives would let me do this, but the Massachusetts Historical Society did. I was also going to the Berg collection at the New York Public Library. They did not let me bring my typewriter in. This was in the mid-1980s and late 1980s. Again, writing with a pencil. But what I did in that case was I went through a lot of letters, and then I saw that some libraries might let you pay them to make photocopies of a certain number of letters. Now you can look at these things and take photos yourself. And even some libraries have these kind of stands where you can put your camera up and take very good quality photos of what you're looking at. But they let me pay to have the microfilm series of letters, which I did. And then that gave them the microfilm that they could then let other people use. And I rented a secondhand microfilm reader and put that in my office. And I read through, this whole, particularly the Cuba Journal letters. Sophia and her sister Mary spent about a year and a half in Cuba, and the letters back and forth among the sisters. Elizabeth had stayed in Boston, and that was when Emerson started giving his lectures, and Alcott set up his school, and Elizabeth was helping them do that. And there was just so much great stuff in all those letters. And I read them on microfilm, and I typed them into my computer at the time. By then I did have a computer to write on, but there were no laptops.
Right. They weren't portable.
Yeah. How things have changed. It's so much easier these days. I have
thousands and thousands of pages left from that Peabody research, which I just have given to the archive at Emerson College where I teach. They were happy to have my research materials, and I was so grateful. And I was able to have a student scan them. So now all these letters that I would page through and try to find what I was looking for, they are actually pretty word searchable now. So I'm grateful for that. Cool.
Now, this is a fangirl question, but I've had fantasies of you writing part 2 of the Peabody Sisters because any chance of that?
No pressure. No pressure at all.
That had been my intention. I don't know how many of your listeners have read the Peabody Sisters, but it's a great saga of 3 sisters who were part of the Transcendental movement. And I take them up through the height of Transcendentalism and to the point where one marries Nathaniel Hawthorne and one marries Horace Mann, and the third is launched on her own projects. And as I was working on this book, it took me 20 years. And at one point I thought, this has to be 2 volumes. And my editor said, no way, nobody's going to do that. So I conceived of a narrative arc that would end, as I said, at kind of on this high note. And I did really think that I might go on and write part 2. I had done a lot of that research, but things, change. The only truth is change. Right. My marriage fell apart. I got a job. I fell in love with writing about Margaret Fuller, a different person, and then with Elizabeth Bishop. And here we are 20 years after the Peabody Sisters came out. And I found that some of the questions that remained with me about what might have been part 2 are actually dealt with in this book. So what became of Sophia Peabody Hawthorne and Una in their afterlives after the Peabody Sisters? So I think that I'm going to continue writing biographical essays that may take up some of the issues, some of the characters that I would have seen in a part 2. But the part 2 also was going to get sad. Mm-hmm. In truth, I don't think the Hawthorne's marriage was all that happy, and I didn't really want to write that. And Sophia, who had been such a promising artist, she stopped, and I didn't really want to write that, as I say in the afterlives. And, the complications that they all, they had wonderful lives. They did amazing things. They founded the kindergarten in America, but that was a kind of institutional history that I wasn't particularly drawn to telling either. So I think I'm going to keep picking out some episodes and putting them in the way I was able to do in this book with the essay in particular about Sophia and her daughter Una, which You have to
Yes.
read.
Oh my gosh, yes, you do.
What might have happened?
No spoilers here at all. It's such a great book, Megan. I enjoyed
Thank you.
every essay, and I'm definitely looking forward to your next work or articles you publish.
Yeah.
Really great.
Well, it was very important to me to look back and kind of see how, see the thread from, the little girl, me, who loves to read books, to someone who had some ambition to be a writer. And as I say in the opening, it was that experience of being in the same room with these eminences, Robert Lowell, Elizabeth Bishop, and kind of forgetting who I was and caring about who they were, that prompted me towards biography. But then, I got to this point, here I am, 70, looking back. What about the people in my life, the people I'd kind of not paid attention to, and who left letters and journals and objects, ice picks, and whose memories I'd carried around with me for so long? Those stories deserved to be told as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Can we just end with you briefly talking about someone important in your life and the cover art for Afterlives?
Yes, thank you so much. The last essay in the book, Left-Handed, which I mentioned earlier, is about the left-handed women in my life, and my mother, the primary among them. She was a very talented artist. I didn't know how talented until I did this research. I didn't really understand, because she had some important shows before she had children, and then a marriage to a difficult person with mental illness, my father, and the need to work and jobs. I didn't really say this actually in the essay. She was trained as a city planner, and that was his profession. She refused to apply for any jobs in that profession because she didn't want to take a job that he might be able to get. The portrait on the cover is a self-portrait by my mother of herself when I don't know much about it. My sister and I came across it after her death, but to me, it looks as if she's in an art class in college. She went to Berkeley and studied with important artists, and in her class was Richard Diebenkorn, who was one of the great California painters that we all know about. And this painting, fascinatingly to me, I realized once I looked at it, shows her right-handed. As I mentioned earlier, all the left-handed women in my life tended to feel this was a sidelining aspect of themselves, and they were a bit, maybe not ashamed, but felt clumsy or awkward. That's the word for clumsiness is gauche, the French for left. So there she is. It's a beautiful portrait of herself. And if you see the whole thing, which is inside the book, she's sketching from plaster models of hands. And it was so well suited to this essay that just, again, sort of like the ice pick one, left-handedness, what does it mean?
Yeah.
And how I initially, when I was little, imagined I would grow up to be left-handed because all the adult women I knew were left-handed. And I thought of it kind of as a superpower, but I began to learn otherwise. And my mother continued to make art most of her life, on the edges of a very demanding life, raising kids and trying to keep the household afloat and dealing with my difficult father. I guess I feel very moved by what I learned of her life after she died, by reading her letters and about the ambition that she held, which reminded me so much of me. Here I'm reading about her applying for grants. I think, I was applying for the Guggenheim and this, that, and the other thing and getting turned down, but I was in a position to keep applying. I was lucky to be able to keep writing, and maybe writing itself is easier to maintain. I mean, this is what we hear about 19th century women to a great extent. They can write, Harriet Beecher Stowe writing Uncle Tom's Cabin on the dining room table, which leads to Betty Friedan writing The Feminine Mystique on the dining room table. We can do that. We can keep writing. But part of what I say there, she was a very wonderful watercolor painter, but I never saw her paint in that way. I never saw her use her watercolor paints. She decided to work on woodcuts, which were quite amazing pieces that she did, but at a much slower rate. She was an artist above all, and that's what I saw in her life. She never let go of that identity in herself, even as she had to step back from her ambition for herself. And I've always felt, and I've been drawn to women like that. I've wanted to write about women who experience life in that way, experience the conflicts and crises that most women do.
Yeah. Well, and she taught you stick-to-itiveness, which you obviously had because it took you 20 years to write the Peabody Sisters, and you did.
She was no longer living when the book came out, which is a sad fact. So to have her, not just, I mean, in some ways it's most important to me that it's her artwork that's on the cover, but she herself is on the cover of a book that I can dedicate to my grandchildren, 5 of them. So there's the generations coming along and a hope for better things for women going forward.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
We have to fight for it. That's the thing, though. You know, I wrote these essays during the time of great change in our world, and I found comfort in finding how other people lived through moments of dreadful change. I mean, can you imagine World War I? You know, but they ran to the danger.
Yes, and I was struck by an essay, I'll call it an essay that you wrote in high school. I won't say anything more about that, but you wrote, anxiety, fear, and frustration are becoming epidemic. And I just thought, and here we are again. So that cycle, and we just got to keep fighting.
Yeah, history repeats itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unless we make a little veer in I don't know. It rhymes. I guess some people say history rhymes more than it repeats. So I think we can learn and improve. And certainly even what we're facing, we're still ahead of where we were.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Good to remember that. Well, Megan, I have one more question, if you don't mind. Okay. And this is about the forthcoming collection, which I was super happy to pre-order.
Oh, yes.
I'm going to do what's called a buddy read with some of our listeners and friends of this book. I've read The Summer on the Lakes in the past, and I've tried the women in the 19th century in the past, and I didn't complete it back then, so I'm really looking forward to reading it this time. And I know there's also essays and letters and everything of Fuller's in here. Do you have any recommendations on how people should go about reading this collection?
That's a very good question. We thought about that a lot. This is the Library of America edition of Margaret Fuller's writings. I'm not the only editor. There are 2 other scholars, one who worked on selecting the journalism, these often advocacy journalism from the New York Tribune, and another who worked on the journals and unpublished manuscripts. You know, I think we imagined people kind of skipping around in it a lot. We wanted every entry to have some gripping quality to it. So if you open it up and started reading there, that would be rewarding too. You know, I think if you read from the beginning to the end, you'd be very happy. But you might read the chronology first, which I wrote at the end. It's kind of formulaic. It has to go year by year. And there's certain things you have to include. I didn't realize I have to give the birth date of every one of Margaret Fuller's siblings, for example. There was one brother that we couldn't find what day he was born, strangely. But it is a bit of a narrative there. And it refers to some of the texts that precede it. So I might start with reading the chronology and then go back. You could read the 2 books. And then, you know, I think the journalism section has an arc to it that follows her life. And then the unpublished works also, they're chronological. They kind of follow her life. And I also selected the letters so that they would read as a kind of epistolary biography following certain friendships. But I think you'll have a sense of that better if you read the chronology first. That's my suggestion.
That's great. Thank you so much. We'll do that.
Well, I'm really glad you're going to be reading the book, and I hope you report to me about
sure will. Absolutely.
Margaret Fuller is every bit as important as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. She was neglected by the Library of America, we thought, but it turned out that they had asked quite early on Robert Hudspeth, who was the editor of her letters. Margaret Fuller's letters are available in 6 volumes, if he would do one of these collections. But he knew Margaret Fuller's papers weren't organized in the same way that Emerson's or Thoreau's or Hawthorne's or whatever were. He knew it would be an enormous labor. And he said, you know, I just can't do this now. So we came to it at a point where her papers were in much better order. He had done the work on the letters. Many of her unpublished works were in print in one way or another, although Noel Baker, who did those, retranscribed them all, realizing there were errors in some of these previous transcriptions. But we really profited from a huge amount of scholarship that had been done on Margaret Fuller. The last thing I want to say about the chronology that was interesting for me, I thought, well, I've written her biography. I can write the chronology. But, my book is a narrative. It's a story. And you don't want to think, well, and then, this year that, this year that, this year that. And so it was really almost the worst thing I could do to try to go from my book to this chronology where I had to know exactly what happened per year. I did a lot of new research in order to come up with a chronology that I think does read as a narrative, but it's a very different kind of narrative from what I was working on in my Margaret Fuller biography. So thank you for reading my biographies and for your interest in this book of essays, which, every book you write, you think, this is the one. And I feel very happy with this. And as you point out, in large part, because my mother's on the cover.
Yeah. It's really a lovely book. Thank you so much for writing it and for sharing your stories and your vulnerabilities and your history. And I just enjoyed it so much. Thank you.
Well, I'm grateful to hear from you, your reactions, because, as a writer, you never really know how it's going to go over. And I hope for that. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.